know, if you've been watching the channel, we've been showing a series of reports on the migrants of the Greek island of Lesbos. Now, the reports sparked by the fire that all but destroyed the Moria refugee camp, forcing many to live on the streets. Some moved to the mainland, others moved to other emergency camps, where many say the conditions are even worse. Now, it's just one of the many, many ongoing issues in Europe and across the world on migration. Those issues, of course, including police violence, discrimination, quotas, borders, difficult and long-standing debates. Well, my guest today, though, urges us to look at these issues from the other side in a rational and peaceful way. He's author of the new book, We All Have a Black Friend. He's François Gemenne. He's director of the Hugo Observatory at Liège University. He also teaches climate and migration policies at various universities, including Sciences Po. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme. Let's pick up on that first point. I mean, you make the point that if we look at it the other way, from migrants' points of view themselves, many of them, of course, have invested their life savings, haven't they, to come to another country. Then they arrive and they're branded by some as the misery of the world.
Yeah, the problem today is that the public debate really isn't that much interested in global migration dynamics, in understanding why people move and in which conditions they do so. They're interested in knowing who's coming to their door. And if we see things from this perspective, which is really self-centered perspective, we fail to capture the complexities of migration, and we think of migration with simplistic views, simplistic concepts, and very often in unrational ways, because the way we see migrants always appeal to our emotions rather than to our reason. So my book pleads for a more rational and pragmatic approach to migration that also considers, as you said, the viewpoint of the migrants themselves.
How do you get people to swap their minds, though? Because, I mean, maybe what they're thinking, they're just fearful, aren't they, when they see those scenes of people?
Well, it's really a cultural battle. And I'd like to say that, sadly, the way we think and talk about migration, at least in France and in most of Europe, is because we've been influenced by the framings, by the concepts, by the terms imposed by the extreme right. And today, a lot of the thinking of the extreme right has penetrated public space, and we are there just providing answers to questions that are being raised by the extreme right. And I think that Democrats, either from the left or the right side of the political spectrum, need to ask questions again and not just provide answers.
The extreme right isn't going to go away, though, is it? I mean, if anything, it's building its base and doing pretty well, particularly in some countries. I mean, for example, Hungary.
Yeah, it's doing pretty well. And what we see right now is that the extreme right has managed to impose its agenda on migration and asylum. And when we look at the new proposals that are made by the European Commission these days, the new pact on migration and asylum, clearly you're under the impression that this pact has been written by Viktor Orban himself. And because we fail to think rationally and pragmatically about migration, we leave the ground wide open for extremists and nationalists. And I think this is the dire state of the public debate on migration and asylum today. I'm hoping that my book can redress that a little tiny bit.
You do say that if we are angry or frustrated, there is someone who we can blame and take this out on, though, don't you?
Of course. And these people do not demonstrate. These people do not vote. And logically, migrants and refugees are kind of easy scapegoats for those who'd like to blame economic or social problems on them. And because we always speak of them in the plural as if they were a group, we see them as a threat to our lifestyle, to our values, to our culture, to our salaries. The reality is that they are not a group. Being a migrant or being a refugee is not really part of their identity. And I think that what we need to do is consider them for what they are, for who they are, which is usually a person like you and me.
And one thing you do appeal for as well is for people to, if they are going to try and target someone, to target the traffickers rather than the migrants.
Yeah, I mean, we are accomplices of the traffickers and the smugglers. We're convinced that we're fighting against traffickers and smugglers, but the reality is that the more we close the external borders of Europe, the more the business of the traffickers and the smugglers develop. It is today the third largest traffic in the world, just below the traffic of weapons and of drugs. It generates about $35 billion of income every year. And therefore, we have encouraged this traffic because the more a border is closed, the more people will need smugglers and traffickers to help them overcome that border.
We're living in a time as well when we're constantly hearing that phrase, particularly from the US, fake news. We've also got social media, of course, becoming such a major thing, particularly for the younger age group. I mean, do you think that's adding to this problem, making it even worse?
Clearly, that is adding even worse. The problem is that when it comes to migration and asylum, the reality is complex. People do not move from A to B from one single reason. There is often a mix of reasons. Migration journeys are spanned over time and over space. And therefore, we tend to think about migration following our intuitions. But the problem is that many of the realities of migration are deeply counterintuitive. And therefore, it is often easier to put forward an easy lie rather than a complex truth. And I think that our challenge as researchers is to explain that this truth is more complex than the simplistic views and intuitive views that we often held on migration.
I wanted to ask you about the title of the book as well. We all have a black friend. I mean, obviously, it sort of sounds racist just in the way that it's written and the way it's said. Why did you pick it?
Well, in France, having a black friend is the typical excuse that one gives when he is being accused of being racist. He says, no, I cannot be racist. The proof is I have some black friends. And therefore, it has become, in the French language, some sort of a motto to basically pretend that you're not racist, whereas you are actually racist. And what I'm trying to say with this title is that our policies have become racist in many ways, are no longer treating migrants and refugees as if they were humans. And we are accomplices of that because we live in a democracy, which means that we're somehow accountable of the policies of our governments, whether we voted for them or not. And I think that very often we refuse to see this, and we like to think that we are not racist, that our policies are not racist, and we need to recognize that they are. And I think that's the first step before we can address the issue.
Good item to end on. Thanks very much for talking to us today. That's François Gemenne, author of the book We All Have
Thanks a lot.
Black Friend. Thanks very much.